What does it take to kill an empire that has refused to die for 1,000 years? For the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed, the answer was 80,000 soldiers and a cannon that could smash mountains. But inside the legendary city of Constantinople, the last Roman emperor had just 7,000 men and one final defiant answer: we will die of our own free will. This is the story of how they did it. For a millennium, Constantinople had been the queen of cities, a beacon of civilization that had outlasted its own western half by 1,000 years. Now, in the spring of 1453, it was a ghost of itself, a magnificent golden cage holding the last relics of a forgotten glory. Its great forums, where legions once paraded and philosophers debated, stood eerily silent, the marble cracked and overgrown with weeds. Its streets, designed for the bustling commerce of 1 million souls, were now quiet laneways connecting sparsely populated districts, separated by fields and orchards where palaces once stood. The air itself seemed heavy with memory, the scent of sea salt and wild thyme mixing with the ever-present aroma of incense from 100 churches. The people, too, were a shadow of their former strength, a few tens of thousands living amongst the monuments of greatness, their lives governed by ancient prophecies that spoke of the city's eventual fall and the coming of a final, terrible judgment. An old legend foretold that the city would fall when an emperor named Constantine, son of a Helena, sat on the throne the same as the city's founder and his sainted mother. The current emperor was Constantine XI, son of an empress named Helena. A grim fatalism had settled over the citizens, a sense that they were living at the very end of history. But the city had one last defense, its one true claim to earthly immortality: the walls. The great Theodosian land walls were not merely a fortification. They were a triple-layered nightmare of stone and death that had broken 23 armies. For over 1,000 years, this symphony of military architecture had stood unbreached, a symbol of the city's divine protection. An 80-foot-wide moat, which could be flooded in times of siege, formed the first obstacle. Beyond it rose a low, crenellated breastwork, a killing ground for any enemy who managed to cross. Behind that stood the outer wall, 25 feet high and 10 feet thick, studded with 96 imposing towers. And behind that, the final, ultimate barrier, the inner wall, 40 feet high and 16 feet thick, punctuated by another 96 towers, each one rising to a height of over 60 feet. This triple line of defense, stretching 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, had turned back Avars and Persians, Arabs in their great jihads, Bulgars, and the fearsome Rus. The people believed that as long as the walls stood, their world would never truly fall. On those walls stood the last Roman emperor, Constantine. He was not an emperor of gilded halls and elaborate ceremony, but a soldier forged in the harsh realities of a declining state. He was 49 years old, a man defined by a quiet, almost melancholic dignity and a profound sense of duty to the impossible history he embodied. He had inherited a title, but not an empire. His domain was little more than the city itself, a few islands, and a sliver of land in the Peloponnese. He had no grand army, no treasury to speak of, and the Christian allies he desperately pleaded with in the West were deaf to his calls, paralyzed by their own political rivalries and the deep religious division between the Catholic and Orthodox worlds. Yet, he refused to yield. When the Ottoman Sultan, in a final gesture of diplomacy, offered him a peaceful surrender in exchange for his life and a comfortable lordship in exile, Constantine's reply echoed with the weight of his legacy. "To surrender the city to you," he declared, "is not for me to decide, nor for any of its citizens, for we have all decided, by our own free will, to die, and we will not consider our lives." Across the water, the source of this impending doom was a man who represented not the end of an era, but the ferocious, brilliant beginning of a new one, Sultan Mehmed II. He was just 21 years old, but he possessed an intellect, an ambition, and a terrifying ruthlessness that belied his youth. He was a paradox, a scholar who spoke 6 languages and studied the campaigns of Caesar and Alexander, and a warlord driven by a singular, all-consuming obsession: Constantinople. To his ancestors, the city had been a prize. To Mehmed, it was destiny. Taking it would not just be a conquest, it would be the fulfillment of an Islamic prophecy, the final act in the centuries-long struggle between cross and crescent, and the true birth of his Ottoman Empire as the heir to Rome. From the shores of Asia, he would stare at the city's silhouette, its domes and towers a constant, taunting reminder of his dream. And unlike the 23 armies that had come before, he believed he knew the secret to breaking the unbreakable. He would not just attack the city, he would smother it. He would bring to bear a power that the ancient walls had never been designed to face. While Constantinople prayed for a miracle, a young sultan on the other side of the Bosphorus was forging one from iron and gunpowder. This was not just a military campaign for Mehmed II. It was the defining purpose of his existence, the culmination of an ambition that had been stoked in him since he was a boy. He was a complex figure, shaped by a difficult youth in the Ottoman court, where he had been overlooked and underestimated. This had bred in him a fierce self-reliance and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. He studied history, geography, and engineering with a feverish intensity, memorizing the failures of his predecessors in their attempts to conquer the city. He knew that brute force alone had never been enough. To take the Queen of Cities, he would need strategic genius, technological superiority, and an iron will that would not bend or break. His first move was a masterpiece of strategic strangulation. In the summer of 1452, he ordered the construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus Strait, at its narrowest point, directly opposite a similar fort built by his great-grandfather, named Rumeli Hisari, or Throat Cutter. It was built with breathtaking speed. With thousands of masons and laborers working day and night, the massive fortress, with its 3 great towers, rose in a staggering 4 months. Its powerful cannons now closed the strait to any ship, cutting off Constantinople from its grain supplies and any potential naval aid from the Italian colonies in the Black Sea. The city's maritime lifeline was severed before the first soldier had even arrived. Mehmed knew the city's ancient walls were its greatest strength, so he sought a power that could turn that strength to dust. He found it in the mind of a disgruntled and ambitious Hungarian engineer named Urban. A master craftsman, Urban was a mercenary of the modern age, his loyalty belonging to the highest bidder. He had first offered his services to the Byzantines, but Emperor Constantine, his treasury empty, could offer him only a meager salary and lacked the industrial resources to build what the engineer designed. So Urban took his talents to the one man who had both the vision and the wealth to fund his creations. He went to Mehmed and promised him a weapon that could smash the walls of Babylon itself. The Sultan, obsessed with the new and terrible technology of artillery, gave him unlimited resources, a workshop, and a salary beyond his wildest dreams. The result was a monster, a superweapon of the 15th century that would change the face of siege warfare forever. They called it the Basilica, or the Great Turkish Bombard. It was a bronze cannon over 27 feet long, a behemoth of destruction. The process of casting it was an event in itself, a hellish scene of molten metal, chanting workers, and billowing smoke. Its barrel was so wide a man could crawl inside. Its chamber was designed to hold a massive charge of black powder, capable of firing a 1,200-pound granite stone ball over a mile. When it was first test-fired outside the walls of Edirne, the sound was said to have been heard 10 miles away, and the ball buried itself 6 feet deep into the earth. And it was not alone. It was merely the terrifying centerpiece of an artillery train of over 70 other large cannons, a concentration of firepower the world had never before seen. As the cannons crawled slowly towards the city, so too did the army. Mehmed had assembled a force of staggering size and quality, an army of at least 80,000 professional fighting men, and by some estimates, over 100,000 including support personnel. This was not a feudal levy of part-time soldiers, it was a modern, standing army, funded and supplied by the full might of a rising empire. At its heart were the 12,000 Janissaries, the Sultan's elite. Taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans under the Devshirme system, they were raised as devout Muslims and trained their entire lives for one purpose: war. They were forbidden to marry, had no ties beyond their brotherhood, and were fanatically loyal to the Sultan alone. Armed with the latest technology, including early matchlock muskets, they were the most disciplined and formidable infantry in the world. Supporting them were tens of thousands of Sipahi, the feudal heavy cavalry clad in gleaming mail, and the Azabs, disciplined light infantry who would form the bulk of the main attacks. And then there were the Bashi Bazouks, ferocious irregulars drawn from every corner of the empire, who would be thrown at the walls first to absorb the worst of the defenders' fire and exhaust them before the main assault. The sheer scale of this preparation was a form of psychological warfare. The news of the superweapon, the throat-cutting fortress, and the endless columns of soldiers marching west sent a wave of terror through Constantinople and the watching Christian world. They were watching the jaws of a leviathan close around them. By early April, the great Ottoman army had arrived. It was a city of its own, a sea of white tents that stretched for miles across the plains before the Theodosian walls, dotted with the red banners of the Sultan and his commanders. The defenders looked out from the ramparts and saw not an army, but a new nation rising before their eyes, a nation whose sole purpose was their utter destruction. As the world's greatest army gathered, the Emperor of Rome could only muster a phantom force. Inside the walls, a mere 7,000 men prepared to face 80,000, a handful of professionals, a legion of armed citizens, and one foreign soldier who chose to stand with a lost cause. Months earlier, Constantine had ordered a census of all able-bodied men in the city, Greek and foreign, who could bear arms. When the tally was brought to him, the number was heartbreaking: 4,983 Byzantines and roughly 2,000 foreigners. This was all that was left to defend 14 miles of walls. The defenders were a desperate, eclectic tapestry of the city's last inhabitants. There were the remnants of the professional army, grizzled veterans who knew the walls better than their own homes, but whose numbers were pitifully small. There were monks and priests who set aside their vestments and picked up swords and shields to defend their holy city. But the vast majority were ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, fishermen, and artisans, men who had never known war but were now tasked with defending the 1,000-year legacy of Rome. The city was also plagued by internal division. For centuries, a bitter schism had separated the Orthodox Church of Constantinople from the Catholic Church of Rome. In a desperate bid for military aid from the West, Constantine had agreed to a formal union of the churches. This act was despised by many of his own people. The Grand Duke, Lucas Notarus, famously declared, "I would rather see the Turkish turban in the midst of the city than the Latin mitre." Yet, in these final days, as the Ottoman standards appeared on the horizon, these deep-seated hatreds began to feel like a foolish, suicidal luxury. In the face of annihilation, they were all Romans now. Their hope rested not on their own numbers, but on two things: the legendary strength of their walls and the skill and courage of one man. His name was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese soldier of fortune and a renowned expert in defending fortified cities. He arrived in January of 1453, not as a paid mercenary, but as a volunteer patriot of Christendom. A member of one of the great families of Genoa, he came bringing with him 2 ships and 700 heavily armed soldiers, all equipped and paid for at his own expense. His arrival was seen as a sign of God's favor, a miracle in a time of despair. Giustiniani was everything the Byzantine defense lacked: a charismatic, energetic, and brilliant commander with practical experience in siege warfare. Emperor Constantine immediately appointed him commander of the land walls, placing the entire fate of the city in this foreigner's capable hands. The defensive strategy was one of pure, brutal survival. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. An open battle was suicide. Their only hope was to use the formidable walls to nullify the Ottoman numbers, to bleed the attackers for every inch of ground, and to hold out long enough for a Christian relief fleet to arrive from Venice. To bolster their defenses, they stretched a massive iron chain, with links as thick as a man's arm, across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the city's natural harbor. This boom would prevent the Ottoman fleet from attacking the weaker, single-layered sea walls inside the inlet. With the chain in place, the defenders could focus all their strength on the gargantuan land walls. Giustiniani organized the defense with masterful skill. He assessed the weakest points, particularly the central section known as the Mesotachion, and concentrated his best troops there, his own armored Genoese professionals. He integrated the citizen militias with the veteran soldiers, giving them structure and leadership. In the final hours before the siege began, a great procession was held. The city's most sacred icons and relics were paraded along the walls, and a solemn, unified mass was held in the magnificent Hagia Sophia. For a brief, poignant moment, Catholic and Orthodox, Genoese and Greek, nobleman and commoner, all prayed together as one. What do you think was the most critical factor in the city's defense? The legendary walls, the leadership of Giustiniani, or the courage of its people? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. From the top of the street Romanus Gate, Emperor Constantine and Commander Giustiniani looked out at the endless sea of enemy campfires that lit up the night. They could hear the low murmur of the Ottoman host, the neighing of thousands of horses, and the distant, rhythmic clang of hammers on steel as the siege engines were prepared. There was no fear in their eyes, only a grim acceptance of the task ahead. They had their walls, they had their faith, and they had each other. It would have to be enough. On April 6th, 1453, the siege began not with a charge, but with a sound. It was a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the ancient city, a physical concussion that resonated in the bones, a roar that was felt as much as it was heard. It was the voice of Urban's great cannon, the Basilica, firing its first shot. The massive 1,200-pound stone ball soared through the air with a terrifying hiss and smashed into the ancient ramparts near the Corinthian Gate. The impact was cataclysmic, shattering a section of the outer wall and sending a plume of dust and rubble hundreds of feet into the air. Then the rest of the Sultan's artillery opened up, a relentless, deafening orchestra of destruction that would not cease, day or night, for the next 53 days. The bombardment was a new kind of hell, unlike anything the city had endured in its 1,000-year history of warfare. It was a constant, terrifying presence, a physical manifestation of the Sultan's will. The superweapons fired only about 7 times a day due to the immense difficulty of loading and the risk of the barrel cracking, but each shot was a localized earthquake. The smaller cannons, however, maintained a near-constant barrage, pounding the same sections of the wall over and over, slowly, methodically, grinding the legendary fortifications into dust. The psychological toll was immense, but the defenders fought back with incredible resilience and ingenuity. Under Giustiniani's brilliant leadership, they became masters of damage control. During the day, they would shelter behind the inner walls as the bombardment raged, but as soon as night fell, the entire city would mobilize. Men, women, and even children would emerge from their homes and work tirelessly under the cover of darkness, using stones, wood, earth, barrels of soil, and anything they could find to patch the breaches. They created new, makeshift barriers that were often more effective at absorbing the shock of cannon fire than the rigid stone walls. It was a hellish, exhausting cycle of destruction and repair, but for weeks they held. Then, on April 20th, a flicker of hope on the horizon. A small fleet of 4 Genoese ships appeared, heavy with grain, supplies, and desperately needed reinforcements. Mehmed, confident his massive fleet of over 100 ships could easily intercept and destroy them, rowed down to the shore to watch the spectacle. What followed was a stunning display of naval prowess. The smaller Christian ships were carracks, their hulls built higher and stronger than the low-slung Ottoman galleys. Crewed by experienced Genoese sailors, they formed a tight, floating fortress, their cannons and archers wreaking havoc on the Ottoman fleet that swarmed them. In a brutal, hours-long battle, the 4 ships, lashed together for mutual support, fought their way through the entire enemy blockade and, with the help of a favorable wind, sailed triumphantly into the safety of the Golden Horn as the entire population of the city cheered them on from the sea walls. The victory was a massive boost to morale and a public, infuriating humiliation for the Sultan. But Mehmed was not a man to be defeated by a single setback. His genius lay in his ability to adapt and overcome any obstacle with audacious solutions. If his ships could not sail into the Golden Horn, he would find another way. He conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity, an engineering feat that seemed to belong to the realm of myth. He ordered his men to build a road of greased logs over the steep hill of Galata, the landmass that flanked the Golden Horn. In a single night, on April 22nd, his engineers and thousands of laborers, using oxen and sheer manpower, physically dragged 70 of his smaller ships out of the Bosphorus, up the hill through a specially cleared forest path, and down the other side, placing them directly into the protected waters of the Golden Horn. When the defenders awoke the next morning, they stared in utter disbelief and horror. The Ottoman fleet was now in their harbour, completely bypassing the Great Chain. The one area they thought was safe, the line of their weaker sea walls, was now a new, vulnerable front line. The stroke of genius turned the defenders' greatest tactical advantage into a horrifying vulnerability. Their brief moment of hope was utterly crushed by an act of sheer, brilliant, unstoppable will. May 28th. After 53 days of relentless assault, an unnatural and eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The constant thunder of the cannons, which had become the rhythm of life and death in the city, ceased. The defenders on the shattered walls, weary to the bone, watched as the vast Ottoman army began to make final preparations for what everyone knew was coming. Torches were distributed, standards were brought to the front, and the dervishes moved among the troops, promising glory and paradise. The defenders knew this was not a reprieve, it was the deep breath before the final, desperate plunge. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI gathered his commanders and the city's nobles for the last time. There, in the torchlit gloom of a chamber in the ancient palace, he gave his final address. There were no illusions of victory, no false hope, only the duty to meet their end with courage. He spoke of their glorious history, of their faith, and of their debt to the city that had nurtured civilization for 1,000 years. He urged them to fight not for their lives, which were likely forfeit, but for their honor, their families, and their God. Then, as a final act of unity, the emperor rode to the Hagia Sophia one last time, where he took communion with his people, Orthodox and Catholic, Greek and Latin, nobleman and commoner, all standing together as one in their final sacred hour. Under the cover of darkness, the assault began. Mehmed, a master of psychological warfare, unleashed his army in 3 successive waves, a strategy designed to grind the exhausted 7,000 defenders into submission. First, just after midnight, came the Bashi Bazouks, the irregulars. They were a chaotic horde, poorly armed with swords, bows, and makeshift weapons, but ferocious. Driven forward by the promise of 3 days of unrestricted plunder and the whips of military police behind them, they threw themselves against the walls in a screaming, disorganized wave. For 2 brutal hours they attacked, and for 2 hours the defenders, led by the indomitable Giustiniani, cut them down. They littered the moat with their dead, but they achieved their primary goal. They tired the Christians and used up precious arrows and ammunition. As the first wave fell back, broken, the second advanced without pause. The Anatolian Turks, a disciplined, heavily armed force of professional soldiers. They brought siege ladders and huge mobile towers and attacked with disciplined fury, focusing on the heavily damaged section of the wall in the Lycus Valley. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, a desperate struggle on the rubble of the broken ramparts. But still, the defenders held. For nearly 2 more hours, they repulsed every attack. They were exhausted, wounded, and hopelessly outnumbered, but their line, anchored by the armored Genoese, did not break. Then, just before dawn, as the first grey light began to silhouette the city's domes, Mehmed played his final card. He unleashed the Janissaries, the 12,000 elite of his army, who he had held in reserve, fresh and unbloodied, advanced in a silent, disciplined, seemingly unstoppable column. They moved forward not with a wild cry, but with a terrifying resolve, their drums beating a steady, ominous rhythm that was like the heartbeat of death itself. This was the final test, the best against the best. As the Janissaries hit the wall, the fighting reached a fever pitch of desperation. It was at this critical moment, with the fate of the city hanging by a thread, that disaster struck. A shot from a small cannon, a culverin, struck Giovanni Giustiniani. The projectile, a stone or lead ball the size of a fist, tore through his breastplate and greaves, mortally wounding the Genoese commander. The heart and soul of the defense collapsed in agony. In shock and searing pain, he begged his men to take him from the field. His bodyguards forced a way through the melee and carried him towards a gate. Constantine himself rushed to his side, pleading with him to stay, to not abandon his men at this crucial hour. But Giustiniani, his will broken by the terrible wound, insisted on being taken to the safety of a ship. His retreat, at the height of the battle, caused a sudden and catastrophic collapse in morale. The men on the wall saw their seemingly invincible leader being carried away, and a cry of panic went through the line. The disciplined defense wavered, just for an instant, but an instant was all the Janissaries needed. At that same moment, a second tragedy unfolded. A small group of Turks discovered that a small postern gate, the Kirka Porta, had been left unlocked in the chaos. They slipped through, overpowered the few guards, and climbed the nearby tower, raising the Ottoman standard from the top of the wall. The sight of the enemy flag flying deep within the city shattered what little resolve the defenders had left. The cry went up, "The city is taken." The organized defense dissolved into a desperate flight. The Janissaries, sensing the break, surged forward and poured through the breaches and the open gate. The 1,000-year defense of Constantinople was over. It is said that great stories of courage deserve to be shared, so they are never forgotten. If you believe this story is one of them, share this video with someone who appreciates the epic tales of history. In the midst of the chaos, Emperor Constantine XI knew the end had come. Tearing off his royal purple insignia so he would not be identified and captured for ransom, he raised his sword one last time. "The city has fallen, and I am still alive," he cried to the few loyal men remaining with him, and together with his cousin Theophilos Palaiologos and the brave Don Francisco of Toledo, he plunged into the sea of oncoming Janissaries near the street, Romanus Gate. He was never seen again. He died as he had lived, a Roman soldier, fighting for a city and an idea that the world had already left behind. The last Caesar of Rome fell with his empire, swallowed by the tide of history he had so bravely stood against. The fall of Constantinople was more than the end of a city. It was the end of an era. The final ember of the Roman Empire, which had burned in some form for over 2,000 years, was finally extinguished. The news sent a shockwave across Europe, signaling a monumental shift in global power and the dawn of a new age. For Sultan Mehmed II, now known forevermore as the Conqueror, it was the ultimate triumph, the moment his Ottoman Empire was truly born upon the ashes of the old. For the wider world, it was a turning point, the end of the Middle Ages, and the violent, dramatic birth of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration, as scholars fleeing the fallen city brought its ancient knowledge to the West. The legacy of that desperate 53-day struggle still echoes today, a timeless story of how a handful of heroes, united by courage and duty, faced down an empire and stood defiant to the very end. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles and pivotal moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next. Thank you for watching.